Hello everybody, welcome to the studio. So today I'm going to be demoing how we prime our panels before we begin our Abstraction by Design classes. And this is basically before each class we do this with our panels to prep them for the Abstraction by Design process. Alright, so what you're going to need is your panel. This is a 16 by 16 inch. It can be unpainted, it can be painted, it can be natural, it doesn't matter. This is basically a primer. Black tissue, a 6-inch broad knife that is flexible, a paintbrush, black house paint, flat, semi-gloss, satin, doesn't matter, and a dry brush. Okay? So the first thing we're going to do is, what we're going to literally do is glue with the paint. The paint is going to act as a glue to glue our black tissue onto the panel. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is take your paint and dip it in there. It's good to not have a full quart or anything like that. Have some of your paint poured into a plastic container or something like that. You don't want to have a full quart doing this because it's going to go all over the place. So what I do is I start with a couple of dollops. By the way, this is a 16 by 16 inch panel. So we're going to do a couple of dollops of paint. Let's do 3. So I've done 3 dollops of paint right in the middle. Put that off to the side, and then start with that middle puddle and start moving your paint side to side, back and forth, up and down, and filling in that center and going towards the edges, but avoiding the edges for now. So remember, I did 3 dollops, right? So you do that. And then as we get closer to the edges, we go off the edges. We never come onto the edge. We call that on the bias, and that's what we do. If you go onto the edge, you're going to drip paint all on the sides of your cradle. And by the way, if you want to protect your cradle, usually what I do is I varnish my cradles first, sometimes 2 coats, and then I put some blue tape on that. All right, again, on the bias, we're going off the edges, but we're making sure that we're hitting the whole panel and we're covering the whole panel. So here we go, off the edge. Still have a little bit in the center. Now, I've just about completely covered my panel. Put that off to the side. As you can see, I have a complete black painted. It's wet with black paint throughout the panel. Now I take my black tissue, okay? And so I go from the top. I come in from the top. I don't come in from the bottom. I come in from the top, okay? And I start pulling. And I can see what I've covered. And I can see that I've covered the whole panel. This is where the dry brush comes in. So you're basically wallpapering, covering the whole panel on top of that wet paint, that wet black paint with the black tissue. All right? Now I've got my dry brush, right? You don't want to mess with this too much because it becomes very fragile. It's wet tissue. It tears very easily at this stage. So get that like that and just take your dry brush and just gently start tamping down those wrinkles and those bubbles. You won't get rid of all of them, and that's okay. Sometimes we actually use those wrinkles or bubbles in the next step of Abstraction by Design. Now I've gotten rid of that. Okay, so with that, I've done all of that with my dry brush and put that off to the side. Now, take your paint and give another dollop right in the middle of your black paint. and gently paint that out. If you need to do a second, but you really shouldn't, because this will go a long way because it's already pretty wet. So you're just taking your paint and you're brushing that whole panel over the glued tissue paper, black tissue. So we've got black paint as the glue, black tissue over that, and now another coat of black paint on top of that tissue. And it's all still wet. So we finish that off. That's done. Here's where I take my broad knife. And one of the skills of this guy is to, you don't want to be touching it at any kind of oblique angle. So what I tell all my students is basically just lay that down, take your index finger and put it right at the top of the handle and just barely pull it up. So now the handle is off of the panel, and just pull. Just pull in a very, almost like a spatula, right? It's very, very flat. And just flatten it out. Looks good. Like I say, you're going to still have wrinkles and all of that. And that's that. Then what I do, you have a little bit of black paint on there. I just wipe it off. And now what we have is we have our panel. We have our black paint gluing down black tissue and then painting black paint over that. And we're just going to let this dry. Once it's dry, we can take sandpaper, and on the edges here we have some overlap. You can see the overlap there. We'll take sandpaper once it's dry and just sand over that. Once that's all dry and sanded, just before we start the class with these panels, you want to put a coat of gloss or semi-gloss varnish on top of it and smooth that out with the trowel or the broad knife and let that dry. So you'll have a coat of gloss varnish over all of this after it's all dry. Okay, that's prepping our panel for Abstraction by Design. I'll see you in class.